We've all done this at one point. You see a crazy motorcycle mod and you're like, man, that looks so good, I have to install it. But after a couple of rides, you realize that this was one of the worst decisions that you've ever made, as far as your motorcycle goes, of course. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. 7 motorcycle mods that you will regret eventually. Now, most of these things actually may work, right, for a ride or two, or maybe even longer. But after my own personal experience or talking to people or looking at what people say about a lot of these mods, you get the idea that most people are not happy with these modifications after a certain amount of time, just because you start hurting, bike isn't running as good as you thought it would, or it just ruins the ride of your motorcycle altogether. And you know, one of the worst things that could happen actually is that it causes some kind of accident on the road, or at very least, you just wasted money on something that you absolutely hate. So of course, I'm going to give you my opinion. I want to hear yours. What are some of the worst motorcycle mods that you've ever put on your motorcycle? Leave those down below. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Now, at the end of the video, I'm going to tell you all the stupidest modification I've ever made, and you guys are probably going to laugh, but I'm going to throw it out there, so make sure you stay tuned for that. Now, here's the first one that we're going to talk about, and a lot of you may not want to hear it, and I totally get it, but it is known as the Harley tax. So there are a number of different upgrades that Harley-Davidson riders, and even Indian riders, a lot of riders do this, where you have to upgrade the bike straight from the factory, right? And exhaust is one of those, but you don't want to make the wrong decision when it comes to exhaust. What I mean by that is buying exhaust that is just too loud. Now again, a stock Harley, straight from the factory, sounds like a freaking tin can going down the road. You're going to want to upgrade that almost immediately. Here's the thing to remember though, loud exhaust gets really annoying. Now, I did find some studies. One was like a Canadian audiologist report. They could have simply put this information out there because, you know, in Canada, they don't like freedom. You know, it's kind of like a big version of California in a way. So we'll just leave that there. But you can definitely get an idea of how loud decibels over a period of time, a long period of time, can definitely increase the stress, blood pressure that you may feel, mental stress, and even fatigue on your motorcycle. When you constantly have that droning going on for hours and hours and hours, at very minimum, it just gets annoying. Sounds good when you start it up, sounds good for a little while, man, it grabs attention, all that kind of stuff, but like I said, man, it can definitely get annoying. That's why I use Reinhardt pipes, by the way. This is not a sponsored segment at all. I've done work with them in the past, but I just love what they do, because when you open the throttle, you hear the exhaust. When you're cruising down the road, it's super mellow. To me, that's the best of both worlds. Regardless, you want to make sure that you try to be very selective and do your research to find what exhaust works best for you, right? Zombie baffles out of Tab Performance, they sound amazing. Do you go on longer rides? Will that get annoying to you over time? Will you be able to hear your Bluetooth as well, you know, or your radio, or your stereo, whatever? Is that going to affect anything that you like whenever you're on your motorcycle? That's something to consider. If you're doing shorter rides and, you know, you're just going back and forth to work, maybe it doesn't mean that much to you. Trust me, exhaust is something that you're absolutely going to want to do. Just take your time when you're choosing it and make sure that you choose something that you can actually live with for hours and hours on end. Now, here's a modification that will not take you as long to realize that you may have just made a mistake, and that is bad suspension upgrades, specifically when you lower the motorcycle. Now, this is going to do some pretty obvious things and then some not so obvious things, right? The obvious things are, if you lower the motorcycle, your compression, your dampening, your rebound, all of that is affected. So the best example I can think of is when I rode my buddy's Ultra Limited compared to my Street Glide Special, or even my Road Glide Special, which had about they were about an inch lower than what the Ultra Limiteds or the standard Street Glides were at the time. And so what I would notice is on his motorcycle, I would not bottom out in potholes nearly as often as I would on my motorcycle. Add more weight, add a passenger, of course this issue is going to be exacerbated. Suspension is one of the most important things you can make on your motorcycle, hands down. And good suspension is expensive, right? It's not cheap, just like pretty much everything on a motorcycle, let's just be honest. But suspension is so crucial when you start taking away what the factory has deemed as the most ideal riding height, spring height, all of that. You can change that out, right? But you don't really want to affect the height of the motorcycle necessarily, because now you're really messing with the geometry. Not only are you just creating issues for yourself as far as bottoming out and all that kind of stuff, but you can also mess with the rake and the trail of the motorcycle. If you lower the back of the motorcycle, that's going to cause the forks to get kicked out a little bit more. So that is going to make the bike harder to turn, but it's going to be more stable in a straight line. If you lower the front of the motorcycle, well, now you're going to have a steeper rake, which is going to make it definitely more nimble, but then it's going to be maybe kind of twitchy at high speeds or a little less stable at those higher speeds. So suspension upgrades are definitely needed on a lot of motorcycles, especially, you know, adding something like Wilbur's, right? I did this on my motorcycle. Fantastic product, by the way. Highly recommended. My buddy Ryan Erlocker at Law Abiding Biker actually sent me a set of these, and I am so grateful, man. This is one of the best upgrades I've ever put on my motorcycle, hands down. So that's perfectly acceptable. That's something you probably want to do, especially with a bike that you're going to keep for a while and you want to get the most out of that motorcycle. But when it comes to like lowering the bike and chopping the springs and, you know, putting cheap suspension kind of parts on there, I would stay far away from that stuff, because really at the end of the day, all you're doing is wasting money. And then when you start to add up the time, the labor, the pain and suffering, you could have just bought a good set of suspension right off the rip. Now here's one that may take a little bit more effort on your part, but I think it's totally worth it, and that is handlebar upgrades. Now again, something that can make a huge difference on your motorcycle as far as the comfort, the styling, everything. I mean, this can be one of the best or one of the worst upgrades you actually put on your motorcycle. For instance, I put the KST spearheads on my 2020 Road Glide Special, right? And I thought 14-inch bars, why not? That's probably going to be the best, you know, for me, not even considering that, you know, I'm 5'7", right? And basically what I wanted out of the bike is I wanted the handlebars to come up just a little bit more, get them a little bit more in line with my shoulders, so that kind of, you know, eliminates a lot of the shoulder pain and stuff that I was having on longer road trips. So I'm like, yeah, that's going to bring them up and it's going to be fine. Well, 14 inches as far as handlebar height for me was just way too much, right? So when I would extend those forward, the ride was not comfortable at all. So I had to pull those way back, and it just looked super goofy, right? If I'm being honest, when I look at those videos now, I'm like, ugh, it doesn't look good at all. Now, the spearheads, specifically those KST bars, they were cool because you could actually rotate those inside of the clamp. But again, it did not, aesthetically, I didn't really like the look of it. They were just too tall for me. And I got all of the extension I could out of the cables. That's another thing that you want to consider is routing cables. What's too tall for your motorcycle? Does your motorcycle have a little bit additional length that's maybe tucked up under the instrument cluster like my bike was? Are you going to have to add length to them? Right, that's pretty common. But if you can get to a shop, I know American Biker actually had a couple of these that had different size handlebars. So you have maybe a 10-inch upgrade, a 12-inch, a 14-inch, and just get an idea of where you want those bars are. Now, I know American Biker had a couple of great examples of these recently, actually, you know, where they had like a 12-inch upgrade compared to a 14. This was on their used motorcycles. So if you go to a shop that has some used motorcycles, maybe you can get an idea of what is comfortable to you, right? So some of the Street Glides specifically, you have very little rotation, if any at all. And so when you put the taller bars on there, you're going to be leaning more forward than what you may think, right? So just taller doesn't always mean better, because you need a little bit of pullback, right? That's something that I wanted. I wanted a little bit more pullback and a little bit taller to get me more, you know, vertical in the actual seat to keep me more comfortable. So a little bit of experimenting and maybe going to a couple shops that have some used motorcycles can make a huge difference. I know some of them also have some displays, right? So this will give you kind of an idea. Having the adjustability of like the spearheads was fantastic, right? So that made it definitely usable for me. Just didn't look very good, and I just didn't end up really liking them that much, but it is what it is. Either way, handlebars, another fantastic upgrade if you choose the right handlebars. Now here's one that may ruffle a few feathers, but that's okay, right? I'm willing to take the heat on this one for sure. Now I've done this, but not on a motorcycle. I did this on my wife's old car, and it worked just as good as what you would think. These $30 light upgrades where you can take your halogen bulbs to HIDs, which are, I think, kind of going away now. I don't know. But LEDs specifically, right? Now, LEDs are fantastic. I mean, the lighting is so much better. I can't even believe we used to use halogens and see anything at all. But if you want to make your lighting at night even worse, take a $30 or even a $100 upgrade from AutoZone or any one of these parts stores, plug it in and see what happens. On the picture, it's going to look amazing. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have LEDs for like under, $30. But the problem is the halogen housings are built for filaments. When you add an LED, there is nothing about it that is going to give you more lighting. As a matter of fact, it's just going to scatter the light even more. So you may have a concentration of really good light on the right side, and then you may be blinding oncoming traffic from the other side. The two simply do not go together. You will get brighter light in like a little concentrated area, but you will basically have probably worse lighting than what you had before. If you add a little bit of oxidation to those halogens and stuff, now you're making that issue even worse, right? So taking a little bit more money and upgrading to a true LED housing and lights can make all of the difference for you. The advancements in lighting are just light years better now. And so if you do a lot of riding at night, I mean, even during the day, right? If you want to be seen, which I think is one of the most important things when you're on a motorcycle, it doesn't always work, but giving yourself the best opportunity to see and be seen is super crucial. Don't cheap out on lights. Buy good replacement motorcycle lights. Custom Dynamics, I've used them a ton, right? A lot of people have. They're fantastic. There's a lot of good companies out there, but if you're going to upgrade, right, to LEDs, just make sure that you get the housing to go along with it. Now here's one that could cost you a little more than just the money that you spent on replacing them. That is trying to cheap out on tires. Basically, you find a set of tires with a name you cannot pronounce and, some crazy longevity type of mileage rating, but here's the truth of it. They will use less advanced rubber compounds in those tires. Typically, they're not going to put like additives in those tires that help to make sure not only the tire actually grips in the rain, but also heats up evenly. So you get like some of these tires which have harder compounds, which could last a lot longer, but it definitely leads to less traction as well. So if you ever put on a new set of tires, right, the cheap ones especially, even after break-in periods and you're like slipping out of the corners and stuff like that, that's probably what you're experiencing. Not only that, you have the tread pattern, right? So good manufacturers of tires will design that motorcycle tread to where it will evacuate water very quickly. Cheap companies, are they really going to take the time, the R&D, the engineering to make sure that your motorcycle tread is going to evacuate water as quickly as it should? No, it'll probably do the job, but it won't do it nearly as well. I don't know if you guys are like me, man, but when you only have 2 tires, you want to make sure those things are as good as possible and buy the best brand you can. I know that, replacing a rear tire every 10,000 miles kind of sucks and it gets expensive, but this is not an area you want to cheap out on. Not only does it come down to the compound, the tread, the additives, and all of that, but your sidewalls as well. They have to cheap out on these things one way or another. So you'll have fewer plies in the tire, different cord construction, weaker sidewalls. So when you hit bumps and stuff, they may deform more under that pressure and kind of change in the road conditions than what you'll find in good tires. And sometimes you'll buy tires that are not like cheap tires, but they just don't seem like they work well with your motorcycle. And there could be a lot of different reasons, from the geometry to mismatched front and rear tires to fitment to roundness to how smoothly the transition is from the middle of the tire to the outside of the tire when you're cornering. A lot more that goes into this than would I even care to really know. But if you find that your stock tires work well, they grip well, and let's be honest, that's what the manufacturer designed those for, when you go to replace them, just go with those. Probably going to get the best life out of that specific tire. They did a lot of R&D to make sure that that tire with the motorcycle, the rake, the trail, everything combined gives you the best ride possible. That's typically the way I am going to go, unless I just find that the stock tires aren't as good as what I was hoping for. Now here's one I'm a big believer in now, and that is seats. Now look, buying cheap seats, okay, you're gonna kind of get what you pay for, right? The foam, it can deform, it's not gonna feel great, and trust me, you can put a number of different add-ons. You know, you have like the Wild Ass add-on, right? It has air pockets and you can add air, you can take away air, right? Those things are pretty good, right? Especially taking for pressure off of your tailbone. Okay, fine. But there's no amount of those things that can fix a bad seat in and of itself, right? So it doesn't even have to be a cheap seat, right? I find that Harley seats are just too stiff almost, right? Their foam feels like, you know, just kind of standard quality, I guess. But I've bought some of the more expensive seats from Harley Davidson, and I don't really like any of them. I've bought the lower profile ones. I bought the heated and cooled seat. You know, that was on my Street Glide Special, I think. I didn't really particularly like any of them. Now I was trying to get a little bit closer to the ground in some situations, right? So trying to take some of the height out of the seat, so that can obviously make a difference. And by far, the best one that I have found is Saddlemen, hands down. But I have to have the road sofa from Saddlemen with the backrest. This to me has made probably the single biggest difference on my motorcycle when it comes to comfort. The seat height is fantastic. The gel insert that they use is kind of like a shock absorber for your butt in and of itself. It has been a fantastic upgrade. Again, not the cheapest on the market, but this is one that you really want to take the time to invest into, because you will find so many different types of seats. Some look way better than others, but I will take a hit on the aesthetics if the comfort goes way up. And fortunately, I didn't have to take a hit on aesthetics either, because Saddlemen's, they look good. They ride good, they feel good, and that's what I've decided to go with. And so I stick to those on my motorcycle, and I don't see myself changing anytime soon. And this is another one that, you know, sometimes you'll find like high-end seats that maybe don't work so well for you. I would also consider, you know, looking around, seeing what people say, trying to decipher, like, you know, who's paid to maybe say that this seat is really, really great and, you know, maybe this one isn't. Sometimes you have to kind of cut through the noise a little bit when it comes to this stuff, but you could definitely find some great seats. Like I said, my opinion, I'm sticking with what I know and what has worked the best for me for longevity, time in the saddle, and all of that. And so Saddlemen's been my go-to ever since I started using them. And here is the last one, and one of the most controversial, especially when it comes to Harley Davidson, and that is, be careful of any modifications that you're putting on your motorcycle when it comes to engine, or pretty much the whole powertrain, right? Engine, transmission, emissions, all of this stuff could cost you thousands and thousands of dollars if something decides to mess up on your motorcycle. Now remember, Harley Davidson was in that lawsuit because, you know, they were like forcing people to buy Screamin' Eagle in order to keep the warranty intact, when people are like, I don't want Screamin' Eagle. But what you want to remember is that it's pretty much still at their discretion whether they can void your warranty or not. So if you do something internally in the engine, whether it's cams or any number of different things that you could, you know, upgrade the engine with, right? Tuners, right? Tuners is probably one of the biggest reasons that people end up losing their factory warranties. anything that changes the air and fuel mixture ratio, you're almost asking for that warranty to be expired prematurely. Emissions and O2 sensors and even exhaust sometimes, right, can be really sketchy when it comes to this. And what I found is that Harley won't necessarily like answer you straight up. So, hey, if I put Reinhardt's on my bike, are they okay? As long as I use a Screaming Eagle tuner. Well, yeah, typically, but you know, I mean, there's like always variations. And so, you know, I don't know how many people like don't actually modify their motorcycle because of a warranty. But I know when I'm buying like a brand new car, a brand new motorcycle, if it's got a warranty, I want to keep that warranty intact for as long as possible because I don't want some big, you know, expensive repair and I'm probably making payments at the same time, right? I got to take one or the other. So just keep that in mind. They can, and I'm sure other manufacturers are going to, you know, kind of be the same way. Harley was the one that took the brunt of a lot of this, you know, heat because let's just be honest, they would always push Screaming Eagle. You know, their stuff is trying to be compliant in every single state, and you know, you guys all know kind of how that stuff works. But regardless, be careful with the parts you put on your motorcycle. You have some really cheap Amazon parts out there. And when it comes to levers and like, you know, handlebar or, you know, bar in mirrors or upgraded mirrors or, you know, a windshield or, you know, stuff like that, there's a ton of different stuff you can do to your motorcycle, right? That's not going to mess with a warranty. It may not look good, but it might look good to you. That's totally fine. But when you start talking about the engine, the powertrain, the brakes, right? I mean, all of the crucial components that you want to make sure stay intact. And not only that, right? If something crucial happens to your motorcycle, let's say a catastrophic failure on the road, it was clearly the fault of the motorcycle manufacturer. They had something out of spec and you end up getting injured, right? You want to make sure that, hey, I didn't change something, you know, and put some $30 part on the inside of the engine to make it, you know, sound a little bit better at idle and potentially cost you from, you know, winning some kind of suit, right? This stuff doesn't happen often, but I'm just saying that there are a lot of considerations that you want to take when it comes to the stuff that you do to your motorcycle. So that's where I'm going to end it for this. Now, I'd love to hear from you guys, man. What is like the worst motorcycle mod you've ever done? I'll tell you one that I did. It actually wasn't on a motorcycle, but it was actually on my very first truck, which was a 2002 Chevrolet S10. Okay, now this one had the 4-cylinder in it, and I got to tell you, man, I tried to make this thing an S10 Extreme as much as humanly possible without doing an engine swap, essentially. And the most ridiculous part I can remember putting on that thing was like one of those little tornado things, right? So it's so stupid now. But it essentially, right, would, you know, change the dynamics of the air when it forced it into the intake. So it was going to give it cleaner air and faster air, right? I think there was like maybe a little impeller or something on the inside of it that just kind of spun once it got air into it. I mean, just so stupid. There's like absolutely no change made at all. The truck probably ran worse with the thing. I didn't really notice, but it was one of the stupidest upgrades I've ever done. And so there you go. There's mine. I'd love to hear yours. Let me know what you think down below. If you like what I do, consider subscribing. See you in the next one. And as always, hold them down.